Good morning, and I welcome everyone to the 15th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee. I once again thank the Broadcasting Office for their work helping organise this meeting. Can I ask everyone to ensure their mobile phones are in silent? Today's main business will be an evidence session on building regulations and fire safety, but first, at item 1, we have consideration of whether to take agenda item 3 in private. Item 3 is consideration of evidence heard at today's meeting. As we're meeting remotely, rather than asking whether everyone agrees, I will instead ask if anyone objects. If there is silence, I will assume you're content. Does anyone object? Thank you very much. Silence is acquiescence in this case. Therefore, that is agreed, and item 3 will be taken in private. Agenda item 2 is an evidence session on building regulations and fire safety in Scotland. This is work following on from the committee's inquiry into this issue earlier in the parliamentary session, and our agreement thereafter to maintain a watching brief on this issue. Almost 3 years to the day since the Grenfell tragedy, it's good to be able to return to this hugely important issue after a period when our sole focus as a committee has been on the impact of the coronavirus crisis. Our discussion today will touch on the Scottish Government's work on a new high-rise inventory and on problems that have risen in relation to apartment buildings with external wall systems. I'm pleased to welcome our first panel of witnesses this morning, Dr Jim Glockling, Technical Director, Fire Protection Association, Paul Stewart, Assistant Chief Officer, Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, and Laura Hughes, General Insurance Policy Manager, Association of British Insurers. I'm grateful to you all for taking time to answer our questions today. Thanks also to the FPA and SFRS for your written submissions, and for information we've allocated around 70 minutes for this session, with a number of issues to discuss with you. For the benefit of broadcasting staff, I will call each panellist by name before you speak in response to a question. I also ask witnesses and members to please give broadcasting staff a few seconds to operate your microphones before you speak. Thank you. We'll now move on to questions, and I will start by asking the general question. Is there a fully competitive market in Scotland among suitably qualified and insured professionals to undertake EWS1 surveys? If there's not, what impact is this having on the operation of the EWS1 system, and what needs to be done to create a competitive market for this work? Would anybody like to respond to that? I do have a couple of general questions for ABI around it.
Very much. First of all, thank you very much to the committee for having me join you today. I know it was very short notice yesterday that we got on the panel, so thank you very much for that. And I'd also like to give apologies for the ABI not having responded to the letter that you sent to us following the previous session that you had that we were not at. More than happy to follow up after today if there are still leftover issues that need to be covered. Going on to the question, I think the ESW1 form was created to try and reduce the issues with zero value home. Unfortunately, it was created without any insurance industry input, and what we have seen is that insurers don't feel that the route that is required to be taken for that form to be completed is satisfactory, and that those completing it are doing enough detailed investigation at the cost which we understand you can get this form completed for less than £100 in many circumstances, to actually do enough investigative detail to understand whether there is combustible material on the outside. So given that and the broader issues around there not really being much of a competitive market in the insurance industry for professional indemnity insurance, specifically related to fire safety, at the moment, no, there is not the capacity in the insurance market to provide professional indemnity insurance for that form, or for those completing that form. And that's a wider issue, which I'm happy to get on to, and that's not just an issue in Scotland, that's an issue across and the rest of the world actually as well. Okay,
so you've highlighted what you consider to be the problems. What do you think are the solutions? How do you see us creating a market where people are going to be able to get the indemnity insurance that they require to make sure that the work is done, to make sure that people are safe in their houses?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Clearly, we're 3 years on since Grenfell, and the insurance industry is generally very innovative. If they can create products and solutions to issues, then they will have. And I think it's important to recognise that the industry has not been able to develop any sort of innovation that would mean that they're comfortable with offering professional indemnity insurance for fire safety risks at the moment. We have worked very closely, we're having very similar conversations with MHCLG as well, work very closely with the Insurance Underwriters Association and the British Insurance Brokers Association to try and understand if there are any routes to creating a solution for this. And we've gone back to ask our ABI members who underwrite indemnity insurance what their risk appetite is. And I think it's important to have noted at this session that there is at the moment not a commercial appetite to underwrite professional indemnity insurance across the UK for fire safety elements. So if there was a solution the industry could have created, they would have done so by now. So now I think it's about looking at how we can work with government to try and look at alternative solutions that might help provide the cover that these fire engineers and surveyors need. But at the moment, that is not going to be available on the commercial market.
Can I ask then, how is it that there seems to be some people have got the professional indemnity insurance and others don't? Because there's some work getting done, isn't there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think when I say there's no appetite in the market, if there are very good risks and they have good relationships with their insurer, then they may work closely with them, and their insurer might be very happy to provide that. But I think what we're seeing is a significant decrease in the availability of that cover for those that are needing it. And that's largely around the disproportionate cost. If you look at a fire surveyor or a fire engineer or a surveyor, they are often a sort of one-man band or a small company. And obviously the insurance premiums that they will be able to afford will be needing to be relatively low, whereas the liability risks they are on the hook for if this form is completed incorrectly and there is combustible material on a building, if there is a total loss, if there's some sort of tragic fire and that means there's a total loss, then that essentially means that the premium that you can charge those significant millions of pounds of losses would need to be so high that it's actually unaffordable for those small companies to do. So it might be that there are some larger companies that are able to afford that level of cover, and that's probably what we're seeing is those larger companies being able to access that cover because of the relationships they probably have with that insurer. But it's more about the smaller businesses that just can't afford what the insurers really would need to charge to make sure that they've got the capital behind those risks.
This clearly leaves a huge gap in terms of protection for residents and owners of properties. What talks have you had with both governments regarding this, about trying to close this loophole? And how do you have any suggestions about how you can create such a market that allows a much more open playing field than we've got at present?
Yeah, so we're currently in conversations with MHCLG about it. And we've had conversations in the past with Scottish Government, but I think probably something that we'll need to pick up on again. And I think that there is also a professional indemnity review that English Government are due to do. There's no further detail on that yet, but it may be that can extend. I don't think the problem, although obviously the legislation is different in Scotland, I don't think the problem from an insurance perspective is particularly different. So there's that, okay. And we've sort of put across to English Government some suggestions about really it would be looking at the liabilities being held elsewhere. So whether that's holding fire engineers and surveyors harmless. English Government are currently looking at whether there's something local authorities can do to employ those surveyors and engineers to try and then the liabilities sit with that local authority. But as it stands at the moment, we are sort of looking round to try and find what possible solutions there might be. And I appreciate this isn't good news for you to hear, but I think it's important to recognise that this, we've been talking about this for 3 years now, and this is really where the industry's come to. And the fundamental need is for building regulations to be allow insurers to have that confidence that actually it's going to work. It's a cyclical, it's a cycle of hard and soft markets in insurance at the moment. Professional indemnity is looking at an incredibly hard market.
Okay, thanks for that. I've got another question, a general question, which I'll maybe come back to later on if there's time, but just now I'll just pass you on to my colleague, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Convener.
Sarah Boyatt.
Thank you very much, Convener. Welcome the witnesses this morning. And I think those questions were really, really interesting. It does leave us with an issue as to where people who live in high-rise buildings actually are in terms of what happens next. If I can just declare a register of interest in relation to my former employment. This was an issue I worked on after the Grenfell Tower fire, which is, as was said now, just over 3 years ago last weekend. And my questions are really about the high-rise inventory, because we've been hearing about the lack of cover and the lack of knowledge in the insurance industry. And I was wondering what progress witnesses think we're making with the high-rise inventory, because knowing what's the position in each building is obviously critical, not just in terms of insurance, but in terms of whether people are able to put their property up for sale, whether they feel safe in the building, and crucially what remedial measures need to be taken. So I wanted to explore around this issue of the inventory and ask witnesses what progress they think has been made, and where are the issues that we need more information, because we still don't know about every building. We still don't know about cladding or fire doors, for example. So just as an introductory question to the witnesses, what they think about progress with the high-rise inventory thus far, and what would be their priorities for what needs to be done next. Thank you, Convener.
I'm very happy to.
Right, on you go.
Sorry, Chair, was that myself you wanted to come in there?
I think Dr. Glockling had suggested first, Paul, and then yourself.
So, yes, very happy to talk insofar as I can to this. Really, an insurer presented with the high-rise inventory, which is a very credible piece of work, would really, have the same objectives as yourself. Insurers look for reasons to insure rather than not insure, but they're obviously duty-bound to interrogate and investigate for risks to any given portfolio. So it's a very welcome thing to see, they'd be taking probably a fresh eyes look at it for potential issues, and then investigate whether they are credible, these issues. And actually, the stages of this process, I guess, might be segregating the list out into which buildings are known to have non-compliant PE polyethylene ACM of the type that was on Grenfell, which are suspected of being non-compliant from other types of systems, where we are finding increasing issues or suspicions raised that other systems on buildings aren't actually compliant, and they may be ACM high-pressure laminates or ETICS types. Also, from an insurance point of view, they'd probably look at which building types might sort of break the basic resilience principle of limiting the use of combustible materials. And I notice in your statistics that ETICS, external insulated cladding systems, features very heavily indeed. And of course, that can introduce an enormous quantity of combustible material onto a building. And then they probably also review which the known potential issues for each of these construction methods. And in ETICS, we know that there can be issues with window detailing, where windows are moved outwards to encourage light on this now fatter external envelope of the building, which can, if the fire stopping isn't done correctly, bring essentially combustible material into the living space itself. And then basically do an investigation and find out, what is good and what is bad within this portfolio. So I guess in answer to that question, treating it from an insurance perspective, obviously looking for reasons to insure on the basis that it's a good business, but with a view of property protection rather than the life safety protection. It's a very good start going through an inventory such as this. The challenges which relate possibly back to the previous question on the EWS forms is where there is uncertainty, what evidence do you have to go on without essentially conducting full-scale testing of what's on the building again? And we know from work that we've undertaken our own laboratories that even very minor changes in geometry of any system put on maybe the 8414 rig can lead to changes in the outcome. And so we are seeing, sadly, people are having to pay for very expensive testing, large-scale testing, in order to move on the conversation, which isn't really anything you would wish on anyone, but it is a complicated system, in fact, situation. And if large-scale testing is all that people are going to believe, then that's the best we have at this moment in time.
Paul Stewart.
Yeah, good morning, convener, and to all members, and thanks for the opportunity to attend today. In terms of the question asked, I think the high-rise inventory is a very good asset in terms of ensuring that information relating to the building risks, etc., is readily available and up to date through a number of avenues across the sector. And the Fire and Rescue Service is very supportive of the creation of the high-rise inventory and its use as we move forward. And I think it's a very good starting point in terms of progressing on a forward basis. I think it also facilitates a good element of cross-referencing of our own records in order to ensure that we have some consistent information right across the sector. So I won't rehearse based on the time available today our submission from the service, but certainly the high-rise inventory, Fire and Rescue Service very supportive of the creation of it, but also I think it's a really good starting point from our point of view.
Thanks, convener. There was a couple of things. If I could just pick up that last point from Paul Stewart there, you were talking about how it's a useful starting point. I mean, one of the things it's a challenge, which we've also heard from Dr. Glocking, is knowing what the condition of the exterior is in terms of cladding or window angles. The other issue that I'm very conscious of through former work and constituency casework is the issue of fire rated doors, whether it's front doors to people's individual houses, and the issue about doors on fire escapes. And what work do you think is important to prioritise in terms of addressing those in buildings? Because according to the high-rise inventory, although there is actually quite high compliance, there are still quite significant numbers of buildings where these are not fitted. And the other issue is about sprinklers as well. So there's a few very practical things where we're not quite there yet. Wondering on your views about how we get that increase in terms of safety.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I'll take them one by one as I remember them, if you don't mind, and happy to come back should I miss any of them out, if you don't mind. So I'll start with the fire doors in terms of those at flat entrances, so the actual front doors of premises within multi-storey flats. And I think the fire door requirements have changed over time. And whilst doors provide a good level of fire protection, the doors themselves within multi-storey flats of individual premises are not certified as fire doors. or may not be certified as fire doors. And whilst the standards of fire doors remain a matter for building standards, the recent guidance issued by the Scottish Government does support the upgrading of doors on a risk basis. As a fire and rescue service, we would clearly support that view, and in particular in terms of the element of prioritisation, it would be particular to older buildings where we may see a differential in any standards applied. So, and we think that can afford additional protection to both the residents and indeed to the firefighters attending incidents where we have a robust door mechanism on the front door of properties. In terms of the fire doors allocated within an escape route or a protected route within the building, further context would be required for us to comment fully. However, existing doors or are existing doors discounted from the return on the actual high-rise inventory itself. And fire doors onto escape routes are included within the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service operational assurance visits, so it's something that we check on a regular basis, and that allows us to have a national overview and provide additional focus in this area. Although we have to say at this stage we have not had many concerns raised around the existing standards within the protected stairway area, and that would kind of cover my answer on the escape stairs. In terms of our relation to sprinklers or the retrofitting of fire suppression systems, clearly as a fire and rescue service we would welcome the installation of sprinkler systems, and such systems can be very key to reduce the fire growth and spread, particularly in flats housing those that may be deemed to be more vulnerable. The high-rise inventory can clearly act as a resource for assessing risk within properties and may consider sprinkler systems where the risk is higher than modern standards would potentially present, so providing a tool to mitigate those risks clearly. It probably should be noted that internal suppression systems are not mitigation for the presence of cladding, because by virtue of the fact that they are internal, and it should be also noted that any major retrofitting can impact on compartmentation, which forms a key part of the fire strategy in high-rise buildings. So that would be a potential area of risk or concern. Now, I'm not sure whether that captured all of the points of the question asked. I think I got through most of them, but happy to take any further questions on that.
Okay, listen, Paul, thank you very much. That was a very full answer, and sorry, Sarah.
Yeah, no, I get that.
I'm going to have to move on. Yeah, I'm sure that you might want to come back later on if there's time for it. But can I just remind everybody that we do have a lot to get through. If we could just try and, I know that some of the answers deserve a full response, but if we could just try and answer as quickly as we can and allow everybody else to get in. Thank you very much. Graham?
Yeah, thanks very much, convener, and thanks everyone for joining us in this meeting. I'll try and, there is some very technical stuff here, so I'll try and keep things as simple as possible. Can somebody tell me, I mean, it may be you, Paul Stewart, whether you're able to look up the details of an individual property as a result of this inventory?
So can you just elaborate that on further in terms of looking up the details of an individual property? So at the moment we conduct operational reassurance visits, which provides us with a degree of information for our operational crews, but I'm not sure if that's the question you're asking.
No. So we've got this inventory, the details provided by local authority building standards. Is someone living in a block of flats able to look up on that inventory their own block of flats and see what information there is?
Yeah, so on that, I know that we can as a fire and rescue service, but I am unsure and not sure whether that can be done by members of the community who reside within a multi-storey block. I know that as a fire and rescue service we can, and we have that information available to us, but I'm unaware of the access that local communities may have.
Okay, so let me put the question then to Laura Hughes. If that information was available, would that be of any use to the insurance industry?
Thank you. Yes, certainly it would be. We're really supportive of the inventory, and actually have been asking for something similar, admittedly at a broader scale. When you're looking at modern construction, we've been asking MHCLG for something similar for a while now. So I think it's important that they understand or will encourage MHCLG to see this inventory as best practice and really look at how they can use it. Insurers are data hungry. They want information, as much information as they can get, and they will at their own decision make those commercial decisions using that level of information. Some will use more, some will use less. That's totally up to them how they do that. But yes, it would be incredibly useful for insurers to have that access, and obviously useful for the fire and rescue service as well to try and understand how to tackle a fire should there be one that occurs in.
Okay, thank you for that. So can we look at the inventory itself? Because I think there are some gaps in it, there are some flaws in it. It only deals with domestic buildings. It only deals with buildings over 18 metres, even though the classification has now changed in Scotland to buildings over 11 metres, so there's clearly a gap there. It doesn't deal with things like hotels, hostels, boarding houses, hospitals, care homes. You know, are these gaps that should be rectified? Anyone can answer that.
I'm happy to start with that. We've been quite clear from the beginning that we do not think 18 metres, there should necessarily be a trigger height on these buildings, and they should really be looking at the at not just high-rise buildings, but high-risk buildings as well, and through that, of any height, looking at the vulnerability of the people that are within those buildings. So specifically, as you mentioned, care homes, hospitals, student accommodation, schools, buildings like that should all be included. But I think, you know, where it is a good start. If it can develop, that would be great.
Anyone else?
Yes, are you wanting it?
Yes, really, just to agree. I mean, the extension to high risk rather than high height seems like a sensible way to go, without a shadow of a doubt. And increasingly, certainly, to focus on anything that constitutes a sleeping risk or a major risk to sort of societal interruptions, such as schools, seems like a very pertinent thing to do.
Okay, and my final question, it's a technical question, so it's probably one for yourself, Jim McLaughlin, or Paul Stewart, or both. So the question there, the inventory, so the questions that made up the inventory, it doesn't request or detail the Euro class ratings of external wall panels or insulation materials, and that makes it impossible to know the material's reaction to fire properties. So that seems to me to be a gap. The report also doesn't appear to request detail from respondents on what type of insulation, like that's external wall insulation, were used on the buildings. So a couple of things there for you to comment on.
You're absolutely correct, but I think we need to balance this out, that if those types of questions had been incorporated, we probably then you may see a very much lower rate of return of information. It may be a question, if you ask for too much, you end up getting nowhere. So I think in order to get to a starting point and the ability to have a conversation today on the results on the HRI, the questions are pertinent, but inevitably in any study like this, you start to wish you had more information at your fingertips. But a lot of the information you're asking for, they are very simple questions, but these are exactly the questions which are holding up progress at every point. To identify installation is very difficult indeed. Sometimes it's unremovable. Sometimes you're presented with a little core sample, and then it gets down to quite detailed chemical analysis, which is in itself tricky, because the difference between insulations and their formulations requires very specialist techniques, which are not commonly available. So I think in answer to your question, if we knew the answers to all those questions, we wouldn't have such a big problem at the moment. But I certainly agree that the further work element does need to start to fill out, include these as new fields and start to fill them out. And then you start to have a truly useful extension of use of the database. So maybe it can start to be linked into the EWS forms, and then you start to have something which can then start to work for you in solving the solution, rather than just highlighting the size of the problem.
Of course, you don't get the answers unless you ask the questions.
This is true, but we know what questions to ask now, and at least we're back filling in something which has a pretty...
We'll have to ask them then.
Yes.
Thank you. Convener?
Okay, thank you very much, Graham. Annabelle?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, colleagues and panel. I've got two questions. One to the SFRS, and if Dr. Gocking would like to comment, that's fine, and the other to Laura Hughes. So my question to the SFRS is, and just really taking the opportunity whilst you're here and given the background to this important subject, could Paul just explain briefly what the SFRS's current stay put policy is? Thank you.
Yeah, so happy to take that question, and thank you for it. Our current stay put policy is as it says. Our current advice and guidance is to stay put within any particular high-rise block. Clearly, if there are developments in a fire incident that would alter that advice, then we would liaise closely with our control rooms and put a plan in place to alter that advice. But that advice would come from the incident ground and from the on-scene incident commander. At the moment, in our standing operating procedure, which has been reviewed, we are still asking our residents to stay put in the event of a fire in a multi-storey block.
Thank you. Dr. Glocking, do you have any comment on that?
The stay put policy is a very difficult issue to address. It is a luxury earned on the capability of the building itself. And I do rather feel that historically, stay put policy has been used to actually cover off other ills, such as very poor performance in alarm and detection systems. And you know, it's very convenient that when you look at the false alarm records of our systems, we're very used to, much more used to false alarms than we are to genuine fire alarms. And it seems all too convenient to introduce a policy which doesn't, by de facto, ask for evacuation of a building, especially when you might be having 4 false alarms a day, which is not uncommon in certain types of occupancy. But is that a good reason to have a stay put policy? Absolutely not. Stay put policy must be earned on the capability of the building, and it's very difficult to understand how a policy can stay in place without that building really being understood for its fire resisting capabilities to ensure the appropriate safety of those that need to get out when there is a fire. It's a very difficult call to make.
Thank you. Thanks. I guess, Paul, the SFRS would suggest that their stay put policy is not based on convenience. I mean, they do a lot of work on operational assurance and so forth of the building, but I'm sure that they can take that up further. My other question, given time constraints, is to Laura, if I may. So in the submission in advance of our 26 February meeting from the ABI had said, we have seen no evidence of changes in either buildings or contents insurance driven by issues involving combustible cladding or zero valuations. Is that still the position?
So I think what we have seen is we have seen some high-rise buildings that have obtained renewals that are deemed by those living and paying for that insurance to be unaffordable. And what we haven't seen here, I think it's important to note, is market failure. It's not a systemic problem with the market, but there are specific high-rise buildings that have combustible cladding on the outside that have expensive insurance premiums. Insurance is written in a risk-reflective way, so that unfortunately that price is reflective of the significant risk that those insurers deem there to be on those specific buildings. We're incredibly sympathetic to those who are experiencing that. Clearly, it's far from ideal, and another burden on top of the stresses of knowing that you live in a building that has combustible materials on the outside of it. The answer to that, in our eyes, is very much about getting the remediation completed as quickly as possible, and those buildings returned to a safer fire risk, and the premiums would then reflect that safer risk.
Yes, but if you can't get in to do the valuation inter alia on the grounds of insurance, which we've discussed already, we go round in a circle. In the evidence that the ABI provided in a written form prior to that meeting, the ABI said a very curious thing: buildings insurance is not a mandatory requirement, but most mortgage companies do require buildings insurance to be in place when lending. Which mortgage companies don't require insurance to be in place?
So I think they all, from my understanding, they all do. What I think meant by that is there's no legislative requirement for anybody to purchase buildings insurance. So if you own a property outright, you don't have a mortgage on it, there's no need for you to have buildings insurance if you do not choose to do it. It's a choice for those that do that, but clearly with the mortgages, that's a requirement from the mortgage companies to have buildings cover.
Yes, but you'd have read all mortgage companies require, because if there's a standard security extant to the building, you'll need insurance. That brings me to my last brief question. When we had witnesses, including from UK Finance, at that meeting in February, I did suggest that for UK Finance, since it is an absolute fundamental condition of the mortgage, of the standard security, that buildings insurance is in place. If buildings insurance is not in place, that is in breach of the mortgage conditions. It's a fundamental, serious breach of the conditions. And therefore, I did suggest that UK Finance, which said it had no conversations up to that point with ABI on this issue, might find it quite useful to engage with ABI on the subject. Have they done so since February 26?
I have had a conversation with Matt Jupp, who I believe was the representative at that evidence session in February, about what that needs to look like. We haven't come to a sort of final solution, but we have had that initial conversation. I think, if I'm being perfectly honest, I think COVID has probably taken over some of those conversations. I think we had that sort of right at the end of March, beginning of April. So certainly something we can follow up and have a second conversation about. But we have had the first one.
Well, that's encouraging, and perhaps the committee can seek to follow that up. Convener, thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Andy?
Thank you very much. Indeed, Convener, I've got quite a few questions, but I'll try and keep them brief. I mean, first of all is on the outcome of the high-rise inventory. It found that 13% of high-rise buildings had rain screen insulation board. Now, in evidence that Rockwool gave to the House of Commons, they claimed that plastic foam products, which are used, have a 90% market share in these rain screen insulation boards. and they're extremely combustible. I'm just wondering if anyone would comment on whether it's appropriate that those should continue to be in high-rise buildings. And secondly, for Paul, Fire and Rescue, I'm just curious, if the stay put policy is there, compartmentalisation continues to be a fundamental principle of fire protection in high-rise buildings. Why is there not more focus on making sure that flats actually do have up-to-date fire-rated doors?
I'm happy to talk about the first question. So on the thank you. On the issue of the other types of cladding, I think what we are finding is that as more experimentation is done on the competing systems, we do find that probably in terms of non-compliance, the problem might be more far-reaching than we initially thought. I'd like to be clear that if you see a fire involving polyethylene of the type on Grenfell, that is a very ferocious fire and probably very different to, it's not a marginal pass in a test. But what we are finding as we start to investigate, probably do the testing that should have been done to assure the suitability of these products on buildings, but may not have been done due to, for a variety of reasons, not least desktop studies possibly. But things like some of the HPL, high pressure laminate cladding systems, we find may not be capable of passing a test and being deemed compliant. And it may stretch further to other ACMs as well. And I think one of the historic problems we had is the test was used as a compliance of material, not of compliance of the accurate geometry actually applied to the building itself. And we know that in certain situations, certain material combinations that may fail initial test, the test allows for that to be reconfigured, possibly have cavity barriers, their positions changed reasonably or unreasonably until a pass is encountered. And so you see, we do not have a very good stock of information to fall back on to really understand what is currently on buildings and what the threat it poses is. But I think the more testing we do, it's only going to lead to a higher population of buildings that need further investigation.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not sure if we have Paul Stewart from Scottish Fire and Rescue on the line anymore, do we, Convener?
They were still trying to reconnect him the last I heard. Yeah. Okay,
fine. I'll move on. I've got a question for Laura Hughes from ABI. I'm still not entirely clear. We've got a situation where we've got high-rise buildings with cladding that is questionable, where for someone to sell the property, they find it difficult to get an EWS form, and anyone who can do that form finds it very expensive to get professional indemnity insurance. And yet the people occupying those flats can get buildings and contents insurance. So I'm just wondering why an insurer would be charging so much money for professional indemnity insurance on the study of the building when the occupant of that building can, although it may be a little bit expensive, can readily get buildings and contents insurance which covers the risk of that building destroyed.
Yes, happy to take that one. I think there's an important distinction between buildings insurance and professional indemnity insurance here. So buildings insurance is about if there was a named peril, fire specifically in this case, the insurer is covering the potential costs of what they deem an estimated total loss. So what they consider there to be the maximum cost that insurer will have to pay. And at the moment, that's really usually looking at rebuilding the whole property. So the industry hasn't pulled out of insuring buildings, and that's largely because they have their own risk management teams that will go into buildings and work with that building owner in many cases to say, you have this type of cladding on the outside, that is presenting a risk to your occupants. these are some of the measures, things like waking watches. If you put that in, then we will continue to offer you cover, and we think that those measures will help with that risk. Professional indemnity insurance is really looking at it's providing insurance to cover the professional advice that an individual gives, so that be that a fire engineer, surveyor, valuer, anyone else in the sort of construction industry. And what we're seeing there is if there is any glimpse of negligence proven, so in a situation where building regulations have been deemed not fit for purpose, so it's difficult for an insurer to have confidence that the individual that they are insuring is going to be able to do everything absolutely perfectly. And if there is a glimpse of negligence, then that insurer is on the hook for the liabilities of all of the work that that individual has done, and historically as well. So that's clearly, in the current environment, a very, very risky and potentially extremely expensive issue for an insurer to be covering at the moment. And we've seen the market's hardened for various reasons. There's an insurer has to have a good understanding of the capital and the reserves that they will need should they need to pay out. But there's also significant sort of legal costs. And these claims aren't quickly solved. They sort of tend to go on between 6 and 8 years in many cases. And the millions that we're on the hook is really where that cover is different. So it's the difference between the two types of insurance, really.
Okay, thank you. Paul Stewart, I think you're back on again. I'm not sure if you heard my question, but it was to do with the fact that stay put and compartmentalisation are still key aspects of fire prevention. So I'm rather surprised that we do continue to allow flats and high-rise buildings to have doors that are not up to date, that are not fire rated on modern standards.
Yeah, so I think the flat doors, the flat doors can be an issue, and I think the standards of fire doors remain a matter for building standards in terms of the recent guidance issued by the Scottish Government, which supports the upgrading of doors on a risk-assessed basis. So essentially, it's a building standard.
No, I understand it's a building standards question, but you as a fire service adopt principles in terms of fire prevention around compartmentalisation and stay put. And so surely it's also an issue for the fire service, because these doors may not support those policies.
Yeah, so from a kind of building strategy point of view within the kind of higher compromise, then clearly it is a fire and rescue service issue, and we seek to pick these up through our operational assurance visits, which we conduct on a regular basis across all watches within all stations. So yes, it's an issue of fire safety or an issue of safety for our operational personnel attending these incidents, but it's certainly something that's of a concern to us where the doors are not of a specific standard.
Thank you. So when you do your assurance visits then and you find one that's not at the standard, you will inform the occupier, advise them to upgrade it, at which point there is no further action. I just find that rather surprising, given that potential vulnerability is affecting fundamental principles of fire prevention and ultimately could compromise the safety of everybody else in the premises. I'm just curious that there's not a more rigorous regime, but we'll leave that there. I just want to just ask you a question.
No, Andy, I'm afraid
visits.
Andy, I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut you off. I'm going to have to move on, Andy. Okay, Jeremy.
Good morning, Convener, and welcome to everybody. I wonder if I could start with a couple of questions. Obviously, we're focusing in mostly on high-rise dwellings, but I wonder if I could ask Laura. Some of the correspondence I've seen is that this height restriction being applied. So, however tall or however small the building is that has cladding on, it is difficult for a surveyor to get that insurance. And it's the situation now that any building, whatever height, if it has cladding, is going to find difficulty getting the reports necessary.
So again, I think that there's two issues here. One, and please do correct me, Mr. Balfour, if I've misunderstood the question. So yes, it's not just about trigger height; it's about high-risk buildings. So from a buildings insurance perspective, an insurer will, as I said earlier, their risk management teams will assess a building and work with the building owner, no matter what height it is, to understand the fire risks and then price that building's insurance appropriately. And then the professional indemnity element, that is covering that professional for the service they provide as their role. So that's not looking specifically at high-rise buildings either. What we are seeing in the market for professional indemnity at the moment is that the insurers will be willing to provide professional indemnity cover across sort of in general, but they may have exclusions around fire safety risk. Or if not exclusions, then high levels of excesses. So the amount that individual would have to pay before the insurance. And that's really because the insurers don't want to take on that risk at the moment due to the potential extortionate claims that they may see. And it comes then back
I wonder if I can come in, because it is the professional indemnity that I'm wanting to pursue. So if I'm a surveyor trying to get professional indemnity, and I go along to a building which may be 2 or 3 story high, and I see cladding on that building without doing any testing to see whether it's dangerous or not, am I going to be able to get an indemnity to be able to do a survey for that property, or am I priced out of the market?
So what we've seen at the moment is that you may struggle to access what you, as the individual surveyor, deem to be affordable insurance cover, because the insurer will probably want to charge significantly more than that individual is able and willing to pay because of those potential costs. So at the moment, what we're seeing is that it will be very, very difficult to do that. Some may be able to do it. We always advise people use specialised brokers to try and make sure they're getting the right cover for their needs.
Great, thank you. And then secondly, and this may be a question for Dr. Glocken or for anyone really, and that is in regard to buildings that have been built at present. So this is not buildings that have been around for any length of time, but are still being maybe built, still under construction. Are we confident that here in Scotland, that buildings that are being built today or a week on Monday when it opens again, are being built to the appropriate standards, and that if someone seeks to get a mortgage in due course to buy that property, there'll be no issues around that? Or are we still buildings being built in Scotland which don't meet standards that we would expect?
Right. I think you've asked it's a very, very interesting question because I think one of the things, particularly for the HRI, is to consider whether it will be a good model to take forward for maybe the next variety of building that might come under scrutiny. Today we're dealing with cladding issues. Tomorrow we might be dealing with another construction method which is ongoing and accepted, but may fall from favour given events. Certainly, we've seen some emerging issues where apartment blocks in light timber frame have responded poorly to fire and ended up, on the ground. These are certainly worrying, and if more of them start to happen, then maybe it starts to cause concern over not only an extended range of current building stock, but maybe ongoing building methods also. Yes, I think whilst things may well be compliant with building regulations, that may not necessarily align with how insurers feel about them as property risks. Insurers deal in terms of EML, estimated maximum loss. Generally, for a multi-storey building, you wouldn't assume the whole building burns down. You may lose the floor to fire, 2 floors above to smoke damage, the floor below to water damage. But if the loss experience starts to tell them that they lose the whole building, then suddenly we're starting to look at insuring buildings as though the whole thing is lost each time. And as soon as that starts to happen, things start to get expensive. And we do have other categories of building which have historically have fallen into that category. In the food industry, where there used to be wide-scale use of polystyrene sandwich panels, they were very expensive losses, they were total, and they were many in number. They became too expensive for the insurance industry, and things had to change. I live in a thatched house. What I pay for insurance, I pay every month what most people pay in a year, but can only be that way because if I have a fire, the whole house will be gone. So you're absolutely correct to ask the question. In everything that you're doing now, I would advise keep an eye on the future to see whether the methods and the investigations that are ongoing might forewarn and be appropriate for sorting out any potential future issues.
If I've got time, Convener, one very final quick question, and that is around the regulations that are in place at present. My understanding is that the regulations north and south of the border are different, and is one of the answers for us to go back and look at these regulations and for Scottish Government and for Scottish Parliament to rewrite them to not in any way minimise the safety issues, but get around some of the technical issues? Would a rewriting of the regulations be the quickest way to get this issue resolved, or is that too simplistic?
I think certainly some very good progress has been made with regulation. Scotland has stuck with the allowance of cladding materials which have passed 8414 testing to go on buildings of height, whereas in England we have and Wales and possibly Northern Ireland, I believe we have a ban on combustible materials at height. So I think it's a part of an evolving thing. As the FPA and with our memberships, obviously we support the curtailment of combustible materials on buildings. The treatment of the external envelope of the building is a primary area which can lead to it's the one form of fire spread that can connect almost simultaneously every compartment of the building. We've sorted out compartmentation internal in buildings is very good. The external envelope of the building is a very special issue. It needs special management, and certainly any guidance that can reinforce the strength of the external envelope of the building to not only fires of the type that we've seen, but we are seeing a propensity for fires breaking into buildings from external sources. That's not something currently covered by regulations. So if there's an extension of the scope of regulations to not only deal with fires starting inside the building itself, but for the scope to ingress from the outside, I would see that as a major consideration that would give quick benefit.
Thank you. I'm done, Convener.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Kenneth?
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, panel. And first of all, I should declare an interest. I'm one of the people in Scotland who's got one of these 46,530 flats over 18 metres. The Fire Protection Association, its evidence suggested that they considered height should be reduced to 11 metres, and understand the reason for that, reducing the trigger height, as Laura Hughes called it. But how could we expand the number of flats and properties included if the difficulty is that we cannot even at this time address the problems associated with the 46,530 flats, such as the lack of specialists able to survey them, the difficulty in getting everyone round the table to agree to pay for that. Surely we should deal with the ones over 18 metres before we try and expand things. I mean, I take into account what Laura Hughes talked about, high risk, however the height, but surely we have to have a manageable problem to deal with before we actually grow that problem.
Yes, from my perspective, I mean, the current situation that we're in is complicated really because we're left with very few degrees of freedom to find a solution from. Combustible cladding is one issue, but we're also talking about combustible cladding on very tall buildings. And people who are at the top of tall buildings are remote from help, and egress can be difficult, long and lengthy. But then that's compounded by another problem, that often the properties just have single stairwells. So when you take these three things into consideration, combustible cladding, which can connect all spaces in the event of a fire, you're at height and remote from help and difficult egress, and you have limited scope for evacuation in a speedy fashion, it is a very difficult place to be. So for the current building stock, we're in a difficult position because it is very complicated. There's very few solutions that can work there without the rather draconian measures being undertaken of changing cladding systems. I think for future buildings, you can help yourself enormously. Combustible products and low buildings have a lesser risk. Combustible products on a building with multiple escape routes, maybe that's a tolerable level of risk. But at the moment, everything's been nibbled away, so the degrees of freedom do not support the easy pursuit of solutions. I don't think I've answered your question properly, but well.
And I don't think Mr. Gibson is going to be able to get back to you to say if you have or not, because I believe his battery has gone and he's out of contact. Okay, thanks for that. Is there anybody else that wants to answer the question that was originally asked by Mr. Gibson? If not, then I'll take this opportunity. Sorry, Laura?
I can just say, yeah, I mean, I think it's a difficult question, and yes, I think you have to start somewhere, and the buildings over 18 metres seems like a good way to start. But I think what we're saying here is that it's not just those buildings over 18 metres that there will be a problem with. Start with them, but also there is the need on a wider scale to look at these other trigger heights and other high-risk buildings as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we now have time maybe for about 2 supplementaries. So, Graham and then Sarah and Andy, I think you might have one as well. No, Graham, on you go.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, convener. I just want to go back to the question that Jeremy Balfour asked, and just ask, well, in a nutshell, can people say whether they think that Scotland should ban combustible materials on buildings, because as Jim Gotwin said, that hasn't happened. So it strikes me as that is what should happen. I just wonder what the panelists think. I mean, it's a straight question.
Happy to supplement Jim on that. Yes, we don't believe it's appropriate to use BS 8414 test in Scotland. I did flag that when I gave evidence to the committee in November, and our views remain the same on that. We do not believe it's appropriate to have combustible material on the outside of high-rise or high-risk buildings that could lead to further fire spread.
Yeah, thank you. Is Paul Stewart with us? No, he's gone.
Paul? Yeah, okay. Jim?
Jim, yes or no?
Well, yes, but obviously I need to declare my interest. Our interests are in property protection and business resilience, and in all the guidance we produce, the 12 commandments of safe buildings, the first one there is to limit the combustible makeup of the building, and the benefits aren't just in just in the issues we're talking about here. The benefits of the selection non-combustibility operate throughout the entire lifespan of the building. We always talk about poor installation, we talk being a problem, we talk about maintenance being a problem, we talk about wear and tear through life destruction. Many of these things become irrelevant when you have a selection for non-combustible material, because they are less susceptible to all of these issues over time.
Thank you very much for that expanded yes. Dr. Gloffling. Graham, thank you very much. Sarah, I believe you've got a supplementary question I'd like to ask.
Yes, thank you, convener. Paul has gone off the call now, but I was wondering if Professor Gloffling might have an answer. Understand his point about the exterior of the building, but I'm still concerned about interior fire safety, fire doors, a capacity to either stop a fire or slow the progress of a fire. And I was wondering if you think we're at a point where we now need to require fire safety doors to be installed if a building is compromised. Thank you, convener.
Right. Yes. The standards that we have in place for internal passive fire protection are very strong, and generally they only fail when they're not adhered to. So I absolutely agree that the preservation of the fire compartment is fundamental to overall fire safety of the building. And if there are problems identified, particularly fire doors, then these need addressing. The rules haven't been written for no reason. They're there, and they're there for very good reason. And time after time, they've saved a lot of lives over their years. The need for additional levels of fire protection, such as the provision of sprinklers, I entirely agree with Paul. These are not compensatory features for buildings being inadequate in other ways, such as a lack of compartmentation elsewhere, or having combustible material on the outside. In fact, that may be a good way of ensuring that they fail to perform their remit. But under certain circumstances, particularly where people are remote from help or are vulnerable, sprinkler systems have a very important role to play in safety. But every active fire protection system must operate within a good passive envelope, and they may fail if that passive envelope is not there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, Sarah, I believe Paul's back. Paul Stewart's back, so excellent. If you want to see if you want to. Paul? No, maybe not. Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, that is bringing us just to the end of this session. Can I just thank Jim Gloffling, Paul Stewart and Laura Hughes for taking part in this meeting, and we will have a brief suspension before we go on to the next meeting. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses, Chris Ashurst, Group Coordinator, High Rise Scotland Action Group, John Bagley, Tangible Assets Valuation Director, Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, and Nicola Barclay, Chief Executive, Home Scotland. Thank you for your earlier submissions. We've allocated a maximum of about 70 minutes for this session, and as I said to the first panel, we have a number of important issues to get through, and I know this is a complicated subject, but it would be helpful if you could answer as precisely as you can. I'll call each panellist before you speak in response to a question for the purposes of broadcasting. Also ask witnesses and members to please give broadcasting staff a few seconds to operate your microphones before you speak. I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask around EWS1 surveys. Do any of the panel feel that there's a fully competitive market in Scotland amongst suitably qualified and insured professionals to undertake these surveys? If not, what impact is this having in the operation of the system, and what needs to be done to create that competitive market for this work? Does anybody wish to kick off?
Yeah.
Thank
you. Sorry, John here, RICS. Thank you for the opportunity to join the conversation here. The EWS form is a process which came about because of the uncertainty around existing buildings, which were once certified as in building regulations or building warrants. In terms of the competitiveness of the market in Scotland, we heard in panel 1 the restrictions on professional indemnity insurance and the hard position that represents. Actually, the number of qualified, competent fire engineers too, which is a problem in England and Wales, Northern Ireland, as it is Scotland. I think in terms of the competitiveness and the openness of the market, depends very much on availability of PI on affordable terms too, and also the volume and quantity of qualified, competent experts in external war systems. I think it's also important to make the point that whilst there are fire experts north and south of the border, the actual sort of precise problem with the war system is a very different type of assessment to traditional fire risk assessment, more associated with property south of the border, which is more about sort of communal issues like fire extinguishers and signage. So I think the two things need addressing. I think probably not competitive, but a functional market for EWS forms north of the border.
John, do you want to come on this? John?
I think Chris has his hand up. I've just answered.
Sorry, Chris. Sorry, I've got the wrong way around. Chris?
Thank you, Convener. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Our evidence from owners in properties across Scotland is that it is almost impossible to ascertain who can actually undertake this EWS1 certification. There are a couple of names that have cropped up a couple of times, but the factors in each development have found it extremely difficult to find it possible to recommend anyone or even approach anyone because the position is so unclear. So the EWS1 certification process and those who can do it is very unclear.
Sorry, my signal isn't great here. Can I ask Nicola Barclay if she has any comment to make on this?
Yeah, I'm here with my hand up, Convener, and apologies if you can't see me.
Can I ask when you want to speak? Any of you, sorry, that you put an R in the chat. That would be easier for us.
Okay, will do. I agree with what the others have said. The EWS1 form for accessing surveyors is not easy. In fact, it's impossible in certain circumstances. And it's not helped by the fact that we're seeing more and more lenders asking for the use of EWS1 forms for all types of buildings, not just ones over 18 metres now. So what is already a thin volume of surveyors able to do the work are being stretched even thinner, which is really not helping anybody.
Do you have any idea of why there's a shortage then?
I can come back on that.
Yes, please.
I think it comes back to what the previous session was outlining. Yeah. There's a lack of surveyors able to afford PI insurance. I think when it started, there seemed to be a number of surveyors able to do it. But the more this issue arose towards the tail end of last year, when they went to renew their insurance, it was so unaffordable that they've had to withdraw from the market, and there's no new players coming in.
It's a little loss as to how some people can still they afford to take the PII, and others can't. I mean, I accept that sometimes it'll be about size, but I was a wee bit concerned that they talked about the relationship with their insurers. Surely this shouldn't be just based around the relationship that you've got with an organisation you've been working with a number of years. Surely this should be something that's pretty much available to everybody at the same cost or for the same reasons as any others. Do you want to come in on that one, Chris?
Thank you.
I mean, it's you that it affects most, I suppose.
The experience is that, as far as we can discern, many surveyors are very unclear, despite some guidelines being put in place, what it is they exactly have to do. I have been given this morning, and haven't followed it through yet because of this meeting, a copy of an ESW1 form actually relating to a flat in our 279 flat development here, and it's signed off as A2. However, as far as we can tell, no actual inspection took place in the terms of actually looking at the cladding. Certainly the factors were not approached with regard to removing anything, and it is only given for that flat. Secondly, my understanding of how this PI matter is resolved is that people who are giving EWS1 forms are inspecting a block. So in our development here, we have 10 blocks, of which 8 are over 16 meters. My understanding of the EWS1 certification process is that each stair will have its own certification. The people who are undertaking these surveys appear to be undertaking a survey, making it available to the factor. Their risk, though, is limited to one flat, i.e. the flat that the person is trying to sell. And each person in that block who then wants to sell subsequently has to approach the factor and the certificate provider to gain a certificate for their own property, for which they have to pay again. So it appears it's an attempt to limit the individual liability on each certificate, and I guess that's a way of limiting the cost.
That kind of takes me on to something else I was going to ask about, which was about any evidence of inadequate or poor quality investigations. What you're really saying is that to some extent the investigations are inadequate, but do you know if there's any? Are you satisfied that cladding systems signed off as safe meet the requirements set out in building standards? Any of you? Chris, I suppose first, but then John and Nicola. Okay, either way.
I want to talk on behalf of all owners and residents across Scotland, but of course my experience is largely here, so I can talk very personally from that. We have a problem in that the final plans for this building have not become available. It was finished around 2008. They appear to have got lost along the way somewhere. We have done our own research by going back to the planning applications to see what materials were specified, and we've tried to establish that the materials on the building are those that were specified. We have no ultimate proof of that, but we are reasonably satisfied. However, that would not satisfy a surveyor. We haven't got the evidence, and so the building, what was built here and in other places, does not tally with the building warrant. So that's significant problem.
Yeah. Okay. Listen, thank you. I'm going to move on to John now because, well, time is an issue here. John?
Okay, yeah, thank you. A couple of points, if I may sort of hit them head on in terms of the EWS process. I think it's important to remember why the EWS process was created in the first place. Is because, as Chris said, buildings are out there which have not been built to the plans and to the certification which is out there. And also the emergence of guidance then sort of brings buildings once deemed to be satisfactory to be no longer satisfactory. So there has to be an inspection process to go through that. And also in terms of that one form per flat and therefore that sort of multiple flats per block, the legislative challenge in Scotland is that there isn't a single entity which there is in England and Wales. So the purpose, the sort of the thinking behind the EWS form is that it is one form per block, which is created for the single entity responsible for the fire safety of the building. And by doing that, you don't have multiple forms or multiple blocks. You have that one form which then is used for lender and is used for valuer. Challenge in Scotland is that that single entity does not exist. So for as long as that situation remains, it makes it very difficult to have that one block inspection and therefore one form. So I think we need to be thinking about how to resolve that. And also in terms of the question about where you have multiple blocks within a site, well, this is about checking that the water system on each block is satisfactory. So therefore, there may well be one block is built completely different to another block, and hence why there will be one form per block, because you have to get to the heart of whether the water system contains combustible materials. Then from that, a decision can be made for lending, a decision can be made for valuation purposes. I think we need to sort of make sure that we focus on the core reason why we're having the conversation, which is there are buildings which are routinely found with combustible materials within the water system at varying heights, and the 18 metres point has been mentioned and the below 18 metres point has been mentioned. There's genuine reasons why those buildings have now come into scope, not least the fact there's guidance which has been issued by MHCLG, but actually routinely buildings are being found below 18 metres with combustible materials, therefore represents a risk to life and limb. So resolution to this is to see how do we get an inspection regime of all the buildings as quickly as possible, so we can risk assess where the most dangerous buildings are within the housing stock, focus on those buildings. I think there's a number of issues we need to sort of move in many respects, whilst respecting what Chris has said about EWS, is to sort of think about how we actually get to a point of resolution with the housing stock which are affected by flammable materials.
Okay, right. Thank you. Nicola, do you want to come on this?
I have nothing else to add. Convener just now, happy for you to move on.
Okay. Thank you very much. In that case, I've run out of time. That's ridiculous. Sarah, on you go.
Thank you very much, Convener. Yeah, it's just to follow up the questions we've just been talking about there about how do we get a resolution. In the previous panel, we talked about the high-rise inventory. Is there more that can be done to make use of it? And how do we progress on getting that information about the existing buildings? One of you have suggested, I think it was Rick's, a building safety manager role to help us progress through this process. And I'd be interested in the Homes for Scotland view on the detailed records issue. It's been one of the issues brought forward, is that what was given planning permission or building warranty permission is not actually what's gone up. So I'm interested in each of the witnesses' views on how we progress to make sure we actually get the knowledge about what's on those buildings at the moment. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Anybody wish to respond?
No.
Yep, I'm happy to go first.
Please,
Can
John.
you hear me? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
As I said in my previous response, the resolution here is certainty and clarity of the housing stock affected by the problem we're talking about. The HRI is a really valuable step forward in identification of buildings and the materials, and to go a step further and to risk assess the buildings, but also to risk assess on the standard methodology. one of the, I suspect, criticisms of EWS is, I think Chris alluded to it, is the sort of what's expected of the fire experts when on site. EWS itself provides technical notes with the pro forma, but there is no standard agreed approach to assessing water systems. So I think it's in terms of how we create clarity. From clarity, we create confidence in the market, but an inspection of all the buildings and then risk assess from there on a standard methodology to have that data available in a safe way to the parties who need to have that. I know, I think it was Laura in the panel one mentioned the fraudulent part of EWS and the central register. That's a piece that RICS has been working on since launch of EWS alongside by Industry Association and with hopefully funding from MHCLG to provide a portal. And that portal could be developed further to be a central register of buildings. And so there's availability of data. The challenge we have at the moment is that there is no availability of data of the housing stock that is affected. And I'm going to say UK because obviously we are facing the same problems. And to assess consistently in a clear manner for all parties to know. And from that, we can start to focus on which the buildings are the most dangerous first. There is a capacity issue. And I think it's really important that A, the owners know about the fire safety, and B, or the other parties know about which buildings are affected to the worst extent. And I think from that, there's the potential to look forward, and it's about looking forward here. So how can we create more certainty in the market? More certainty in the market for lender, for valuer, for buyers, for sellers. You know transparently what's the extent of danger is the wrong word, but what's the extent of remediation needed on the building you're in, and the building you want to buy, and the building you want to lend against. These are all considerations that the general public need to know about, so do lenders, so do valuers. And actually, as you create certainty for the PI market has a greater degree of certainty of risk because it is about risk as well.
Okay, thank you. Nicola?
Thank you, convener. Thank you, Sarah. You touched on the point, Sarah, about how do we know what information is available. I think as of today, we are in a much better position because we have digital registration, digital capturing of building warrant applications, the golden thread that is mentioned on a number of occasions that feeds through. We can see the inspection regime. We're collecting photographic and other digital evidence as buildings are constructed now. So I really, I do think the HRI is a great source and it should be developed much further. And as new buildings are constructed, they should be added to that so that as we go forward into the future, we know that we've got a central portal of information, so we don't need to go hunting for the information. We are dealing with a legacy issue here on the basis of previous kind of standard procedures of paper-based warrants, not requiring as-built drawings. And obviously that's been mentioned by Chris as a challenge for him and his fellow owners of their block. But I think the HRI is a useful starting point, but it could be populated with a lot more information, which would be useful for all those people who have an interest in this area. I know you asked earlier about the accessibility of the information. I'm not aware that it's a publicly available resource. I think you have to have a specific need, and obviously we've got to be really careful that it doesn't blight certain buildings in the short term. But that's something that I'm certainly happy to take back to the ministerial working group that I'm part of.
Thank you very much. Chris?
On other owners associations is that the HRI form, in a sense, has caused a blight in itself because people can check and see these are the buildings, therefore it's on the list, we don't know what's in it, and even buildings that are probably, I would not hesitate to say 100% safe, but are 98% safe, are on the list, so everyone is affected. So it's a significant issue, and it's a great step forward. I can't see where else the government could have started. They had to start somewhere. Great. It's a starting point. But in the last session in February, I think it was the representative of the management companies used the phrase boots on the ground. That's expensive. There are two expensive things. One, the most expensive is remediation, but it may also be that there ought to be a fund that actually provides to meet the cost of inspection in each building, so we can get on with it, get instructed, get proper qualified people looking at it to ascertain the problem. But as it is, it needs to be developed. And in my thinking, I'm thinking, I have a car, it's over 3 years old, it has to have an MOT test. I can look online and see, has my car got an MOT test? This is looking forward, but the HRI could almost form the basis of a government-held register, essentially like an MOT test. And you can look online, when was it last tested? Okay, it's 4 years ago, that's okay. Have a test every 5 years. It is available widely, so that anyone can check it, like I can check on my car. I know it's, maybe slightly crazy thinking, but I sense that HRI could be developed into much more, and on the basis of proper inspections having been carried out.
Okay, listen, that's the sort of thing that we'll probably discuss in the private session, Chris, but we really need to move on. Sarah, do you want to come back in here? Can I ask again, but for the witnesses to, as a dense subject, but if we could just try and make our answers a bit shorter so we can get more questions in. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, James. It's a very brief question. If we're looking at how you prioritise what's next, there's been a fund down south. Should that be prioritised? Should we have one up here as well that would look both at inspections, and then we'd let us have a proper discussion about potential remediation and who pays for that? Thank you.
Nicola?
Yes, absolutely should. You asked to be short.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, from me too.
Yes, from me too.
Well, there you go. If we followed that example, we'd have been all finished and we've been having our lunch break. That's. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah, you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, I suppose the issue is then the priority, isn't it? From the evidence we've had, the issue about the knowledge of what's there appears critical. I understand that the Ministerial Working Group will be consulting over the summer on a Scottish advice note. Is this one of the key things that needs to be in there about potential funding and how you would prioritise it and how you would implement it on the ground? Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Sarah. Again?
Hi. Sorry, John. Yeah, absolutely. The really welcome piece of work with the advice note. It's about clarity, it's about consistency, and it's about sort of acting at speed as well to be able to risk assess the buildings and the greater information that can be provided to facilitate that, and to facilitate that in a consistent manner is to be applauded, and we very much welcome the development of that. I think it's also thinking about, in terms of the remediation fund, think about the mechanics about how that might be accessed. It's a first come served basis south of the border, whereas should it be riskiest first, and also maybe it's a case of thinking about ring fencing, a sort of bad book, loan book type scenario we had during the credit crisis to allow this to move forward without fear of sort of reprisals, so PI can get involved as well. But absolutely welcome the advice note, which will create and to have that at the back of or centre front really as they develop that advice note going forward as well.
Nicola?
Yes, I think we do need to look at prioritisation, and I have to admit I haven't looked in any great detail at the HRI, so I don't know whether it lists who the developers are or were, and I'm aware that a lot of the buildings affected are 2008. So the developer who was there probably doesn't exist anymore. So there may be an issue that there is nobody to go back to. I'm aware of a couple of our members who are voluntarily recladding buildings themselves and paying for that at fairly significant cost, it has to be said, but they're doing the right thing morally. But we will have issues where there is nobody to go back to. So there will have to be a prioritisation should funding be available. I know the £1 billion fund from Westminster isn't even going to touch the sides. I think they're suggesting it might cost 50 billion in total in England. So we've got to be aware that that money will not go very far, even though 1 billion does sound like an awful lot of money.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to move on now. Jeremy?
Thank you, Convener. I wonder if I could start, and maybe with Sarah, but others can maybe join in here. I mean, obviously this is a long-term issue, but I just wonder if we can look at the short term with the housing market starting to open, with people starting to want to sell houses, move houses. From your experience, what effect is this going to have on the property market, particularly maybe in the Central Belt, Edinburgh, Glasgow? And how do we mitigate it, not in the long term, but in the short term? So if I want to put my, flat, which is a third-storey flat, on the market, and I want to move house, is that going to be possible, or are we caught in a bit of a circle here?
Nicola?
Sorry, I wasn't sure whether that question was for me or not, but happy to come in there, Jeremy. I am really concerned that this is going to cause catastrophic impact layered on top of the already challenging market that we're going to be seeing over the next 18 months as we come out of furloughs. We're going to see a real economic downturn. My main concerns have already been recorded. We've already discussed how the EWS1 doesn't really work in Scotland with multi-ownership blocks and no one single owner. I definitely think we need legislation to allow factors to have the power to go in and do one form per stairwell at the very least. That's got to be the priority, to allow those people that need and want to move home to do so. Otherwise, I'm really, really concerned about what impact this will have on the market at a point where it is going to be difficult anyway.
I don't know if John wants to come in or not.
Yeah, I do, yes. Yeah, I just agree entirely with Nicola's comments there. The legislative differences in terms of that single entity is challenging. But I think also we need to not forget that resolution is not to replace one flat owner with another flat owner. Resolution has to be to get to the heart of the problem as quickly as we can. The absolute sympathy for everybody who's caught up in the whole cladding flat scenario, but it wouldn't be appropriate just to facilitate another transaction for somebody to buy a property, but to ease the burden of somebody who's already in situ. I think we sort of need to focus on that as well, because there's a danger that we try and facilitate a transaction for a new buyer, but actually the root cause still remains, and the root cause is a housing stock, flammable materials potentially, and I say potentially because until they are risk assessed, we don't know the extent of remediation works needed.
And Chris?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Nicola. Just to say that the EWS form in owner's mind is the holy grail. That's what you've got to achieve. However, in the last week, what we've found is people who hold EWS forms, both under the A category and B category, once they've got them, have still been declined mortgage facilities, lending facilities. So people are still unable to obtain the finance even with one in place.
Okay, thank you. And my second question was one that I asked previously to the first panel, and that is around the issue of buildings that are still being constructed or are under construction at the moment. From your experience, is this still an issue? And how do we address that issue both in the short term and in the medium term?
I'm happy to come in, convener, on that point. Yes, it is still an issue. We have members telling us that they are being asked by mortgage lenders for EWS forms on buildings which are under construction just now, being built to the current building regs that meet all the fire safety requirements through law, and yet lenders are being so risk averse that they are asking for them when there's absolutely no requirement for them just now. I wish I knew the answer. I think we are seeing a real tightening of the lending market, and they are becoming more risk averse to lending. They're reducing loan to values almost on a daily basis at the moment, and unfortunately I think this might be just another excuse for them not to lend, especially into the new build market.
Okay. John, do you have any comment on this?
Yeah, thank you. Part of the interesting to hear that the buildings built to the latest regulations are being captured within the EWS. One of the challenges, north and south, is that there is still part of building sites built to pre-combustible ban building regulations, and the system allows that. But to an extent, there will be new sites still built to the old system. The decision to request the EWS is still a lender-based decision. I think to take it forward and take it away from the group is actually to have a conversation with UK Finance and Building Societies Association and to get to the heart of what the concerns are with new build. I think in the previous panel we spoke still about the credibility of the inspection regime and the building regulations. I suspect there'll be a confidence issue still, that the buildings are being built as they are supposed to be built as per the plans, because we know with current stock that hasn't been happening.
Thank you. Because of time, I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much then. Andy?
Thank you very much, convener. I mean, this whole saga seems to it seems that we solve one problem and then another problem appears, so we have to keep them all in mind. And I was struck by the comment of Nicola Barclay, and I think John agreed that legislation would be one way of at least making sure that the ESW process could apply to the whole block. There may still be problems, of course, but it could apply to the same block. And I would encourage you to push that point hard in the ministerial group. I've got one question about the ministerial working group. Why are there no owners represented on it?
Who's the question to, Andy?
Chris, have you had any contact from the government?
Well, I think that's exactly the point we are making, that if it's to benefit Scotland and the owners, it would be sensible to have an owner's voice in there, which is really why we've set up this action group, in order to have that voice, not to criticise, but to try and cooperate and have a voice in. It may be that when the EWS forms were being designed, had owners had a voice into that, there might have been some change in the way that they were designed, although of course they were designed primarily for England.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Do you also know the answer to this question? How many owners of properties in Scotland who are facing a problem with zero valuations and not being able to sell, how many are there? Do you know?
No, we're building that. We've been going for about 2.5 weeks, and we're now. Obviously, there's thousands upon thousands, and we are still trying to ascertain, actually using the inventory, where the flats are, contacting the owners' associations in order to get that information, and we are building a spreadsheet to do that as we speak. So I'm sorry, no, I haven't got the answer.
Okay, thank you. And in relation to the high-rise inventory, I note that all the government has published is actually a summary report. The actual inventory, the actual database, doesn't seem to be anywhere in the public domain. The Paul Stewart Fire and Rescue Service said earlier in the previous panel, of course, they have access to it, but are any of our panelists aware of any plans to publish this? Because I understand some of the concerns there may be, and I think they were reflected earlier, but it's that publishing this, making it all transparent is not going to cause any significant problems. There might be some short-term blight, but in the longer term, the more people know, the better. So does anyone know if it is going to be published?
Can I ask Nicola to come in first on this, if she?
Yes, I actually wanted to comment on the previous question, Andy. I absolutely believe that owners and occupiers should be involved in the working group. I've certainly seen over the lockdown period a number of owners contacting me directly about other things, and I can only think that would be a good thing if they are involved, because they are the people who are directly affected. In terms of your question about accessibility to the HRI, I'm a bit like yourself. I've only seen what's on the government portal. I do believe it should be made available publicly. I'm sure only those with an interest will go looking for it, but it should be available for those who do have an interest.
Okay, thank you very much. And I just want to follow up a previous answer that Chris Ashurst gave as well. He claimed that he knows of owners who have had ESW forms that have come forward and been compliant, and yet they've still been refused lending. Can you confirm that that refusal of lending is based on the ESW form result and not on some other factor?
Obviously, I don't know what the decision process was in the lender's mind, but certainly in one case where an EWS form was provided, there was then a request. I am not clear whether it was from the buyers or whether it was from the mortgage lenders, that there was also added on to that a certificate that the buildings were built in accordance with the building regulations. That's one, and I don't know why in other cases. I think in one case, as in many of these buildings of the 2003 right up to date, the buildings are okay. We have a metal balcony, but there are wooden slats on it. They're outside the building. Everything else is fine, but the wooden slats on the building seem to be perhaps the stumbling block.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I was also sorry,
John wants to come in on that. John wants to come in on it.
Yeah, thank you. Just to the A1, A2, B1 classification within the EWS, whether the lender lends against that is a lender decision, but my understanding is, certainly from having spoken with Nationwide Building Societies, that A1, A2, B1 on the EWS would not be a prevention of lending, but with lending there's so many other factors that go into it. But in terms of would those classifications of EWS alone prevent lending, they have confirmed not. As I say, there's a whole number of lending decisions that go on before funds are released.
Yes, no, I understand that, and that's a really important distinction to be made. The ESW form was created in order to provide some confidence, but there are other factors coming in. I was just concerned that there was evidence being presented by Chris that perhaps the EWS form was being used, the building was found to be compliant, and that lenders were still, on the basis of doubts about the building, being reluctant to lend. Nicola Barclay mentioned new builds and EWS forms still being required and lenders being reluctant to lend. If this is the case, and current homes are being built according to the latest regulations, and presumably there's much more transparency around a new build now, because lenders, it's going to be much easier for lenders to know exactly what products are being used in it, because it's been built literally in the last year or two. If that is the case, then this has massive implications for the whole housing market. if lenders are being so risk averse. Does this not suggest that there should be some scheme of perhaps government underwriting to the market to ensure that it continues to function, and that buildings that are being built and are clearly compliant with the latest standards are marketable?
I'm assuming the question is for me, Andy. In terms of whether the solution is government underwriting, I wouldn't want to comment. I haven't thought in any great detail about what the solution is. I do know, though, from our members, they are not putting any cladding on the outside of any buildings that they're building now. Some of these issues are, in fact, Chris mentioned, small bits of decorative timber on outside balconies, which have a distance between that of a steel frame balcony attached to the building. They are being refused, even though there's a gap, So I have members going back and taking off wooden panelling, putting in other things, having to go for retrospective planning consent because it's a different detail. I certainly know that all our members who are building now or designing product now will have no forms of cladding on because they just do not want to risk not being able to sell their stock once it's up. What we do with these products which are in the process of being built to current regulations, I think that's a question we need to take back to that ministerial working group, and I'm sure your committee will be advising them accordingly on what you think the solutions might be.
Okay, thank you. Just sort of my final question to Nicola. Sorry, convener.
Sorry, John had suggested that he wanted to come in on that point. Sorry, Andy.
Sorry, no, Nicola's answered the question. I think in terms of that latest building regulations, have a conversation with lenders. Let's take it offline.
No bother, John. Right,
okay, and
sorry,
my
Andy.
final question.
On you go.
Final question for Nicola. I mean, Chris sort of hinted at this. I mean, if I purchase a car now for £25,000, I'll get a PDF file with 100 pages of certifications for all the elements of that vehicle and its materials and safety standards from various EU and international directives, and I'll actually have the copies and the certificates if anyone ever doubts that it was being built to modern standards. You were saying that the new builds are the information being captured digitally, but is that information actually being provided to the homeowners as a document that says this is exactly what your house is, what the materials are, and all the rest of it? Because it seems to me that if this information is captured centrally, that's great, that's an improvement, but we're still rather neglecting the fact that people own these and have paid money for them, and we have less risk if everybody knows this information than if it's held in one central repository, perhaps each local authority, where it's vulnerable to being lost.
I know that new build homeowners get a very comprehensive home pack when they move in. I don't know the specifics of that answer, so I will come back to you. I will go and ask, and I'll answer the committee separately if that's okay.
That's okay. Could you confirm whether you think that would be a good idea?
Absolutely. I think there's a concern when people move into their home that they are overwhelmed with all the information that they're given. But I know more and more of our, especially larger members, are providing digital information. Whether that's an element that is provided as well, it makes sense. I just don't know categorically whether that happens just now, so I will go and find that out for you.
Okay. I have another question, convener, but I'm not sure how much time we have.
No, I'm afraid not. Let's see if there's time at the end, but I doubt it, Andy. Sorry, Annabelle?
Thank you, convener. Good morning. Well, just 12 o'clock, good afternoon, panel. Yes, picking up on a few issues that have been raised. John referred shortly prior to my opening question to a potential issue of lack of confidence on the part of lenders in the building standards process and compliance therewith on the part of builders. Could he expand on that a bit more, please?
Yeah, thank you, Annabelle. more of a sort of suggestion. I think in terms of why the EWS has been requested for new build if a building is clearly built to the latest building regs with the combustible ban. I think we should have a conversation with the lenders because it's a lender-based decision. Our own guidance within the EWS with our RICS is if it's not built, if you're not satisfied it's built to the latest building regulations, then to request the EWS. So I think the answer to the question is to get to the heart of the issue is to speak with the lenders, and I think that's that I would gladly be involved with for RICS with UK Finance because I don't have a real understanding why they might be requesting that, but I think maybe there's a confidence. I don't know. I was sort of more a suggestion than a statement.
Well, indeed, it seems
Chris,
that many of.
I
was just going to say, it seems many of these roads lead back to UK finance. Before Chris comes in, because this may interest him as well, I wanted, as a supplementary, to ask John, in terms of slightly more historical scenarios where there are problems, why are there problems? Because after a certain date, was it 2005, 6 in my head, sorry, there's lots of different dates, but after a particular point in time, the rules were clear. Is it a problem in terms of the process of the local authority granting a completion cert? Are they under too much pressure to do it too quickly on the part of the developer? For many of these cases, we have to go back a bit in time. What is the role, or what has been the role of local authorities in all this?
I can't really comment on the reasons why, but the result of is that there are buildings which could not be built to the actual plan. So what's constructed on site is very different to past plans. The inspection regime possibly hasn't found different construction techniques going on site. So, for example, fire breaks missing, cavity barriers missing, and this is at heights of 18 and plus and below 18, where almost routinely there are buildings being found to be defective and to have materials that they didn't expect them to have or not built to plans. And I think one of the greatest challenges is that traditionally the valuation process is predicated on the assumption that building regulations, the building warrant inspection process can confirm the part of the buildings you can't see are constructed properly. And it's quite clear in the era post-Grenfell, that isn't the case. So you are essentially re-inspecting buildings that have already gone through an inspection regime, and that's why the challenges are so great before us. That's also why they are so voluminous. And then when we bring into the additional guidance which emerged in January this year, together with the balcony guidance which emerged post-Barking, which brings buildings of any height into scope, and with a real chance that there'll be remediation works recommended. And quite routinely as well, we hear of fire and rescue services requiring removal of wall systems on existing buildings. That is a challenge from a lending proposition, from a valuation proposition, and actually more importantly from somebody wanting to invest, wanting to buy. They need to have the transparency of the state of the building, and for reasons, maybe several, the building has not been constructed as would suggest. So there's probably a number of reasons there, and the output is ultimately, is there confidence in the building regulations, building warrant process on existing stock with the wall system? I think for as long as the confidence isn't there and the credibility isn't there, we do have to have that sort of working at pace to risk assess buildings as quickly as we can. So we know the extent of remediation, and then from that, parties can act transparently and to have confidence and to bring clarity to the extent of works needed. Rather long-winded, I apologise.
Okay.
Chris.
That's right. Can we let Chris in now, Annabelle?
Just to say the point about as it is now. Historically, although building warrants were signed off, there was precious little actual inspection by local authorities, and essentially, especially the larger builders, and it essentially is larger builders because of the size of the developments, self-certified, and so they're telling the local authority, yes, this is all right, and very few cases were actually followed through or inspected. that's the evidence that we're certainly getting everywhere. And just to back up John's point, I forgot what I was going to say now. He made a point about, no, forget it. Brain's gone.
It's the longest because that's a much complex area. I've got a question for Nicola and then a general question for all three if anybody wishes to respond. So for Nicola, a couple of issues. One, a feature of what we're hearing is that there's a great difficulty in getting back the planning documents. I just wonder what are the rules applicable to developers in this regard? Are there any rules applicable? Have they got, as a lawyer, for example, you have to keep certain files for 10 years. I don't know. Are there any rules applicable? What's the practice in the guide?
I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid. I would think it would come from building standards. So that may be a question to the Building Standards Division, what the rules are around keeping buildings. We have to remember that many of these buildings were constructed by companies that may not exist anymore. Slightly to contradict what John said, or sorry, what Chris said about it being larger companies. Pre-recession, there were many smaller companies that were able to access finance to build even quite high-rise on a design and build contract, but they were not companies that stayed beyond the recession. So if that company doesn't exist anymore, I can only assume that the only place where records would still be available would be through a building control department of a local authority. And I imagine their archives will be fairly robust.
Okay, thanks for that. And that is indeed, I suppose, the other route before there was all the online provision. So I think we can make inquiries about that to help people in that situation. You've mentioned a few times, Nicola, the idea that companies developed, went out of business. So that's that. Okay, that's one issue to be looked at. But of course, there'll be many instances of this problem arising where the builder is still very much in business. So you've mentioned that a few have stepped up to the plate. What is the percentage, or do you have those figures yet? In terms
I
of
don't have. Sorry.
Problems where the builder has stepped up to the plate, where the builder is still in existence, and is that something you'd be able to find out?
As this is all emerging and we're turning our attention to cladding now that we're moving out of the COVID lockdown, it's certainly something I will turn my attention to. As I say, I am aware of a couple of my larger members who are going in proactively to reclad buildings that they constructed. They obviously don't own them anymore. They've been handed over to all the individual owners. I think as part of that high-rise inventory, if we have a list within that of who the developer was, we will be able to very quickly find out whether they are still in existence. And also something that's not been discussed is the role of the warranty provider. All of these buildings would have been built with a 10-year warranty, whether it was NHBC or others. They would also have been checking the buildings. And I know NHBC have done some retrospective cladding work when the builder is no longer available. So we should maybe look at that route as well. I'm not saying that absolves developers of their responsibility, but the warranty provider does have a role in this as well.
Well, yeah, absolutely, to the extent that the warranty is still extant, but I think it's a good point, and one perhaps the committee can pursue and seek to get further information from NHBC. My last question then, open to all three, if you wish to respond. Looking at the future, we've had discussion about, in broad brush, about what's happening down south and about possible remediation funds and so on and so forth. I mean, my understanding about the scheme down south thus far is that, first of all, unless it's been amended, certainly initially, it's only applicable with respect to those over 18 metre, buildings over 18 metres, and secondly, the individual is required to take reasonable steps to, find some way of recovering the sums involved, whatever that means in practice. So, there are a few caveats there. But looking to what we do here in Scotland, I mean, are we looking at some kind of loan fund then? I mean, we have to also, we're currently in the middle of a mega economic challenge with COVID-19, mega, and I don't imagine there's going to be an awful lot of spare money hanging about. So how do we best proceed? Because the key thing we want to see is a way to solve this problem and to allow owners to feel safe in their homes and be able to sell their homes and move on. And, we all want to find a way of doing that. But with regard then to that, has a loan fund been considered as part of the possible solution to this?
And can we keep our answers brief, please?
I think all of the above is the answer, and nothing should be off the table. There is a pot of money available in England, certainly. There are challenges about how to access that. I think it's about using the money that's available wisely and thinking about how to remediate as quickly as possible, and then to think about how maybe that's clawed back. I don't have a sort of silver bullet here, but I think we need to think about how you quickly pay and risk assess and get buildings remediated, and then have a process maybe of clawing that back at some later point. I think there needs to be a centralised, coordinated approach here.
Nicola?
Yeah, John has said exactly what I would have said, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Chris?
The question I'm being asked is any of the money that was supposedly coming from Westminster being earmarked to cover these sort of costs, specifically with regard to cladding?
And that's something we can look into. Okay, Annabelle, thank you very much. Graham?
Yeah, thanks, convener. The panelists will be pleased to know that I'm probably the last questioner. A lot of this, actually, this committee has done a lot of work on this over the years, and a lot of what has been said, particularly in regards to the system of building warrants, of signing off buildings, is something that we looked at a number of years ago, and it was clear at that time, and it's clear today, that buildings can get built, buildings have been built, they've gone through the building warrant process, through building standards, and at the end of the day, you don't actually know what has been built, and that, it seems to me, is the issue. So, in terms of the inventory, all the information on the inventory has come from local authority building standards, who don't know what's been built. So does that make the inventory flawed? Perhaps we could ask John Bagley.
I think it goes back to what I've sort of my theme through today is the HRI is a great step forward for documenting based on the information that's available. We still need to know what's on the buildings. We still need to risk assess, and we still need to know what reality is. A great first step, which we all welcome, but to get to resolution here, we act at pace, and it has to be risk assessing exactly what's on site. That unfortunately can mean intrusive works, but actually also, and this kind of feeds into EWS, and one of the reasons why a desktop exercise might be carried out, there could be buildings there with sufficient records and sufficient involvement of experts who know how the building was built. But the fundamental point is there needs to be the point where we know what's on the outside of the building and it has been completed and constructed as it should be. And that's one of the great issues we face with the current existing housing stock.
Yeah, and that inventory that's not going to tell you that. The only thing that will tell you that is if people actually go out and have a look. The inventory is a paper-based exercise based on local government records, which may or may not be accurate. So if we can, I think there's been some positive ideas come out of this session. So one of them was I guess we could call it a building MOT. I mean, is that something that you, John, think would be a good idea? I mean, I don't know how easy it would be to do on existing buildings, but certainly from here on in, anything that's built could have it.
To keep it short, yes, I think that would be a fantastic idea.
Yes. Okay, Nicola.
Nicola.
Yes, I think so. I think you have an issue just now with buildings which are constructed, but then over time there's no clear maintenance regime put in place. We've seen that with the tenement work that you're very well aware of as a committee. I think this is absolutely fundamental to the built environment that we have some kind of regular monitoring and testing of all buildings, which is not there just now.
Okay, and sticking with Nicola, and I will come to you, Chris, but Nicola, I think it was Andy Whiteman asked this earlier, do you not think we should have, when a building is built, the owners should know exactly what is there, not what's been approved, but what is actually there? So the builder would have to say, this is how we've built it. This is what you've got.
Yeah, I do think that's important. And if you think, especially for low-rise residential, there is a possibility in the future that somebody will want to extend that home. So they need to know exactly the construction method, what was done, especially as we go to off-site manufacture. We're going to have a wider range of construction types being delivered that your regular customer won't know the technical detail of. So we need to make sure that they have that information for any future maintenance or work that they want to do within their home. And as I say before, I will check that is whether that's available or not. I'll come back to the committee on that point.
Yeah, I doubt it is, but do you not think that we would need legislation to introduce such a system? Make it mandatory?
Again, that's something that I'll see whether it happens just now. If not, that's obviously a recommendation for your committee to decide on.
Okay, and Chris, what do you think of those ideas?
100%. I think the sooner the better. The owners need to know what they're living in.
Yeah, just like, if you bought a car. Down south, there was a proposal, and I don't think it's gone through yet, to have a building safety bill. Is that something that panelists think would be a good thing in Scotland? Chris Ashurst? Sorry, John.
I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer that question. It sounds like a good idea, but I won't go further than that.
What about John Bagley?
Yeah, I mean, it's due to sort of go through for all said shortly with a live date in October. It does create statutory obligations on parties for fire safety of buildings. It does, I mean, we do have the regulatory reform order in England and Wales. You do have the single entity, but it also then extends the current fire risk assessment to include the external wall system. There are sort of safety mechanisms that the fire safety bill creates. I think it's a matter of coming back to the original problem with EWS in terms of Scotland, is that there's not the single entity to confirm the fire safety of the building, and one of the sort of themes that runs through the fire safety bill, that you do have that single entity and creating a person with responsibility for fire safety. So as a takeaway for legislation for Scotland, something to really think about, and also that would facilitate very quickly being able to risk assess the buildings, which we do need to do.
Okay, my final question, it's really to John and Nicola, because you both sit on this working group. Now, according to a letter from Kevin Stewart that we got, that was established to develop a Scottish advice note on external wall systems. It seems quite narrow. Now, you're meant to be publishing, it doesn't actually say when. Perhaps you could tell us when you're going to be publishing your advice or a list of recommendations.
I think that's a separate work stream. There's a work stream on the advice note. The ministerial working group that I'm on with Nicola is about the essentially the EWS and the inspection process, and to make sure that fits to Scotland. Now I'm leading the portal side of that, so I think it's two separate work streams.
Two separate, okay. Is this the ministerial working group you're on?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And is that going to be publishing recommendations?
it's only met once, so I don't know. I would have thought so, but I don't know for sure.
When did it meet?
March time, just as COVID came in.
All right, that completes my questions, convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Graham. And that completes our questions and concludes our evidence session with the second panel. Can I thank Chris Ashurst, John Bagley and Nicola Bartley for taking part in this meeting. So if you would just like to hang up, that would be the end of your involvement. Thank you very much again for all your help. And that concludes the public part of this meeting. I propose we take a 5-minute break. Please accept the clerk's meeting request for that discussion, which you are about to be sent. Just exit the meeting by clicking on the red telephone icon.